Like many of you PlayStation 5 gamers, more than likely you're playing The Last of Us Part 1. And if you're not, you probably have played The Last of Us either on the PlayStation 3 or the PlayStation 4 remaster. While playing the Part 1 version of The Last of Us, the PS5 version, I've been thinking more and more, not necessarily about the remaster or the remake as they like to call it in this version, which is just a game with some up graphics, better accessibility options, a few gameplay modifications that are more in line with The Last of Us Part 2. And if you want to have my full thoughts and first impressions of The Last of Us Part 1, you can check out the video I did for Quinn Pop. But playing The Last of Us Part 1 has actually drug up some memories, some thoughts, some really criticisms for the sequel that necessarily didn't need to happen, but a lot of us all wanted to experience. And that was The Last of Us Part 2.
I don't know what happened.
Now you're probably thinking that this is some smear campaign to talk about how terrible The Last of Us Part 2 was, how terrible the story was, how they did Joel wrong, how they did Ellie wrong, and how much Abby was just an albatross to the entire narrative. And while a lot of those things are true, there is one prolific scene in this game, The Last of Us Part 2, that to me ruin what they were trying to go for and essentially ruin an entire character. Now, I want to give a little backstory to my connection to The Last of Us, the franchise, the game, and now even Part 2. When it came to gaming 7th generation, the fact is that not only was the Xbox 360 more affordable than the PlayStation 3 at the time, but also had a majority of the games I was looking forward to that originally I thought was going to be a PlayStation 3 exclusive, like Grand Theft Auto 4, Final Fantasy 13, and even Virtua Fighter 5. And then there were the multiplayer games, with Xbox Live being the premier online multiplayer experience. Games like Left 4 Dead 2, the UFC Undisputed series, and even Mortal Kombat, the 2011 reboot, all had me just playing on the Xbox 360. And that was until 2012, when I saw in a Game Informer magazine a preview of The Last of Us. Between watching gameplay reveal trailers and reading the preview over and over again in the Game Informer magazine, they sold me on The Last of Us. And more importantly, they sold me on buying a PlayStation 3. So in October of 2012, I purchased the PlayStation 3 Slim with the 500 gigabyte hard drive because I was thinking that a majority of the games I would be playing would not only be exclusives, but also multiplayer games I missed out on while playing on the Xbox 360. And though The Last of Us was pushed back almost 8 months later, I still was excited to play on the PlayStation 3, plus start buying some Blu-ray discs. So when The Last of Us was released in June of 2013, I was ecstatic, and thankfully it lived up to the hype. The gameplay, the lore they were setting up, the world in general, and most importantly the characters, had me engrossed from beginning to end. And when it was all said and done, I felt that this was one of the most rewarding experiences I had had as a gamer for I don't know how long. But the end of The Last of Us, as open-ended as it was, felt satisfying. The relationship between Joel and Ellie, that presented a father-daughter narrative between two people who didn't understand each other and grew and blossomed into this wonderful connection, even though by the end Joel decides to be a little selfish, which is understandable considering the loss Joel suffered at the start of this gigantic societal breakdown. So, by the end of The Last of Us, I was satisfied. I didn't need a sequel. I was happy with the story that was told, but there was always talk about a sequel. Being as successful as it was, pretty much you could expect that there was going to be a sequel, even if it didn't need it. So when it was announced that The Last of Us Part 2 would occur, I was excited. I was intrigued. The trailers that they showed off were both graphic and somewhat confusing considering the characters being depicted. We didn't understand who Abby was, who the Seraphites were, and most importantly, we didn't know what was going on with Ellie and Joel. Joel, as Ellie was, looked older as well, but almost ghost-like in the way he was presented. The way he oversaw Ellie in the trailer made you almost feel like he was the guiding force instead of the main protagonist like he was in the original Last of Us. And that was exciting because we knew then that we were going to play as Ellie a majority of the game. But then something unfortunate happened. Just several weeks before the game was released, a bunch of leaks exposed some of the major narrative twists when it came to The Last of Us Part 2. And one of those big reveals was that Joel dies. And he dies at the hands of a girl that we witnessed in one of those trailers, in the form of Abby. Now, the big twist isn't that Joel dies. It's not actually surprising that he did die in The Last of Us Part 2. But the fact is that Abby not only would be responsible, but we would also play as her. A lot of backlash happened when it came to the announcement of The Last of Us Part 2, and it was followed by those leaks. But I still came in with an open mind. A majority of the leaks and the reveals I avoided so I could come in mostly clear-headed. So why do I feel, even to this day, that The Last of Us Part 2 fell apart from a narrative perspective? Well, as I just mentioned, one of the big things that was a talking point when it came to not only the leaks but the eventual release of The Last of Us Part 2 was the way that Joel died. We find out that Abby's father was actually one of the Firefly surgeons that Joel killed when he saved Ellie from having the surgery that essentially would kill her but potentially would find a cure that would help society. Abby never let go of this rage and this want for revenge to get Joel back for doing something that essentially she would do to someone else as well. And that is destroy the life that she had become so accustomed to. Abby is able to get away from the Fireflies, and the Washington Liberation Front is formed, a militia group based out of Seattle, Washington. With this separation from the Fireflies allows Abby to become not only a more trained, combative individual, but also gives her the will and the want to have the ability to kill Joel if she ever has the opportunity. So 4 years after the events of The Last of Us, we find ourselves in a position where Joel and his brother Tommy encounter the Washington Liberation Front, mostly importantly, Abby. Joel realized pretty much after he encounters Abby and saves her from a group of infected that he's in trouble and accepts his fate. He understands his punishment had to come, and, of course, Ellie wouldn't be there to see it. Unfortunately for him, Ellie and her girlfriend Dina were actually en route to find Tommy and Joel because they had been gone for so long. And the worst timing in the world could happen for not only Joel, but also Ellie, because she would witness her surrogate father's death at the hands of Abby. This traumatic and gruesome depiction of Joel's death left a lot of people upset, and I understand. Joel was a beloved figure and a character we had gotten attached to because of our time with him in The Last of Us. So to see him be cut down so brutally, so graphically, and most importantly, so quickly after the game began, was heartbreaking. The trailer that depicted Joel and Ellie teaming up once again with the intent of getting revenge was actually proven false because they never had a chance to team up in this game beyond flashbacks. So Ellie understandably goes on her quest for revenge, and by doing so she kills a bunch of people that are associated with not only the Washington Liberation Front, but also Abby's close personal friends. Ellie spiraling down into depravity and downright insanity is fueled by bloodlust and revenge, but is offset by Dina and her calming voice and hope that, hopefully, once this is all said and done, they can go back to Jackson and enjoy a peaceful life together. But that peace is emphatically shattered when Abby discovers where Ellie and Dina are actually staying in their quest to find where Abby is. After Abby shoots two of her close friends, including Tommy, Joel's brother, the game cuts off. What should be this climactic moment of Ellie fighting Abby to the death actually segs into a peaceful time in Abby's life, interacting with her father, collecting coins, and being reminded what it means to be a good person, before her world is completely torn asunder as Joel runs a rampage through the Fireflies, kills the scientists including her father, and leaves the Fireflies with nothing but a painful reminder that their intent to try to help the world was torn apart by one person. And this is one of the biggest flaws when it comes to The Last of Us Part 2 for me. It's the pacing. Some of the ideas of where to place the narrative pieces didn't flow as well as I think they thought they would. For example, the introduction to Abby officially in the game is through a dream sequence that leads into her waking up and eventually her confrontation with Joel and Tommy. So we really don't get a chance to understand who Abby is as a person other than the fact that she's obviously having an affair with a friend who has a girlfriend elsewhere. We don't understand what really makes her tick other than she's a military brat. We really don't understand why she wants to hurt Joel so badly. Now, of course, the surprise of her killing Joel is a big deal, and it shows from Ellie's perspective just how ruthless and dangerous Abby is. But from a player's perspective, it vilifies Abby almost immediately that the person that saved her would eventually become her victim. And even though he does explain, even though he does understand, we don't see it. We don't understand visually why Abby hates Joel so much. They tell us, but they don't show us until very much later on. And by later on, I mean after spending hours playing as Ellie, killing a bunch of ex-Fireflies, and trying to get closer to getting revenge for Joel. In Abby's introduction scene early in the story, before she confronts Joel, before she kills Joel, there was an opportunity to do the same exact thing that we saw following Act 1, essentially. And that is seeing the peaceful time of Abby spending time with her father before everything breaks loose, simply because of Joel's actions. This peaceful dream sequence of seeing Abby walk around collecting coins, talking to her father, saving a zebra from a barbed wire fence, could have been used as an introductory point as to how idyllic her life was before we got to the gameplay section, and most importantly, before we got to the confrontation between herself and Joel. This little bit of exposition would have helped make us understand why Abby was so angry, why Abby was so violent toward Joel. It wouldn't have taken away the surprise of how she brutally killed him, and it wouldn't have taken away the heartbreak of Ellie watching her father figure die at the hands of some unknown individual. They could have easily progressed the story in the same manner without this almost haphazard switch in tone. Their attempt to really vilify Abby and then rectify that by having you play as her is hurt by the idea of seeing such a peaceful moment come after such a harrowing experience and a potential confrontation. But after the game switches the focus from Ellie to Abby, we get some backstory, we get some understanding as to why Abby is the way she is, and eventually we get the opportunity to see Abby grow, or so we think. Playing as Abby, we get a lot more understanding of who the Seraphites are, a group of more primal fighters who rely on bows and arrows and specific calls. They are dangerous, they are cunning, and they are easily connected to some of the best gameplay sections of both games. It is through the Seraphites that we are also introduced to Yara and Lev. The brother-sister pair save Abby from being killed by the Seraphites, and Abby tries to return the favor by saving Yara after she suffers a broken arm and eventually an infection. Eventually, Yara sacrifices herself so Abby and Lev can live. But before that can happen, Abby and Lev go on a journey in search for medical supplies, and it is here where we learn about Lev. Lev is actually a transgender man. She was born a girl, but her want to be a warrior and essentially feeling more like a man than a woman caused him to embrace who he really felt he was, which is something completely against the Seraphites' beliefs and causes Lev to become an outcast in his own community to the point even his mother can't stand him. And it is through their journey that Abby learns a level of understanding both visually and audibly that really we would have never expected from her. So after Yara's sacrifice, Abby returns home only to find that her friends have been slaughtered, including her ex-boyfriend Owen and his current girlfriend Mel, who just so happens to be pregnant with his child. Abby discovers a map that reveals the culprit's location, and that's how we come to the moment that ended Act 1, of Abby busting into the theater and confronting Ellie. But unlike the end of Act 1, where we assume, since we've been playing as Ellie for the majority of the game, that we would take control of her to fight Abby off and potentially kill her, instead we play as Abby, as we take on this squirrely, yet incredibly dangerous Ellie, who proves to be one of the hardest boss battles in all of The Last of Us, be it Part 1 or Part 2. As the player, you have to be cunning, you have to be smart, you have to be fast, you have to react in a manner that's almost unusual compared to how you've had to fight off other individuals because of how unpredictable Ellie can be. But after you do defeat Ellie, it leads to a cutscene. And for me, this was the point that The Last of Us Part 2, the story, fell apart. Because at this point we've gotten to know just how much of a toll this whole trek and journey for revenge has taken on not only Ellie, but also Abby. While Ellie's mental state has deteriorated and her physical state has become worn, Abby, however, has grown more empathetic. She's learned about people and societies that she really didn't understand and just hated because she was told to. After Ellie is taken down by Abby, Dina gets involved. And of course, Dina not being the fighter that Ellie is, let alone Abby, is taken down and with a knife to her throat via Abby, she is put in a position that could result in her death just like Joel's. Ellie, through pained eyes, says that she's pregnant. Before there was Dina and Ellie, there was Dina and Jesse. Jesse, like Ellie and Dina, lived in Jackson. And before Dina and Ellie became a couple, Jesse and Dina were, and of course, Dina became pregnant. So with Abby, given this new information that Dina's pregnant, this defenseless individual is stuck at her mercy. Ellie can't save her. Abby's left with the choice. Truly present herself as the monster that Ellie has seen her since she killed Joel, or be the person of redemption and change. And then this one scene ruins everything that not only they have been building up to with Abby's character, but to me, The Last of Us Part 2.
She's pregnant. Good. Abby.
Instead of showcasing her empathy, instead of showcasing her growth as a person, Abby returns to being the same terrible person that she was when we first encountered her. Her road to redemption is blocked off right there by her own actions. The fact is that if she never encountered Lev, this wouldn't have mattered, because Lev was her catalyst for change. While you can say that looking at Lev and seeing Lev's unapproving glare was proof positive that Lev changed Abby, she shouldn't have needed that. She should have had everything to make her decision then that she wasn't going to kill Dina. She should have had everything in her to say, I would not kill Dina, once she found out that information. She had been shown that revenge begets revenge, violence begets violence, and death is all that surrounds it. And yet, she went in there trying to kill Ellie. Understandably so. But when she's given information that would prove that she has actually grown as a character, she doesn't use it. She doesn't use it to make her road to redemption any more emphatic. She doesn't use it to prove that she is a changed person, or at least a growing person. She's still a monster. She's still a revenge-fueled beast, just like Ellie assumed she was, because she was ready to kill a pregnant woman in revenge. And that's, for me, when The Last of Us Part 2 fell apart completely, because there was no going back. There was no sympathy for Abby. That might be a little cold, might be a little harsh, but for me that was the facts. They had an opportunity to truly make Abby a sympathetic character, an understanding character, and a character that exemplified not only growth, but a road to redemption completed. And instead they went about one simple action that ruined everything. If only they just had Abby look at Lev, not saying a word, and then doing the exact same scene of letting Dina go and telling her never to be seen again alongside Ellie. That would have emphasized that she understood just how dark of a path she was going down, and thankfully Lev was a beacon of light, a beacon of understanding, and a beacon of growth. But instead, Abby was a terrible person. It was just re-emphasized with one act that could have resulted in not only the death of one person, but also an unborn child. I appreciate you all for listening to this and letting me get this off my chest. This has been a long time coming, and something that really I didn't ever think about doing or saying, other than in my own conversations with friends at any time we talked about The Last of Us Part 2. Feel free to leave your comments, agreeing, disagreeing, or just give me your own opinion as to why The Last of Us Part 2 is a good story, a bad story, a well-told story, a bad-told story, while some of the characters worked, why some of the characters didn't. Whatever you feel like. Once again, thank you all for listening, and I hope you have a good one.